So the magic of technology is bringing us together, and I've been spending a delightful few days listening to Adam's various podcast appearances since the release of his amazing book, Secondhand. And I did want to just mention that if we don't get to everything I want to ask him today, there's lots of different ways that you can engage with his work. And I've just been so inspired listening to it again, because when I first heard about Adam Minter's work, it was recommended to me by some other scholars in the field of discard and waste studies. And I can't really emphasise enough how much these two books, Junkyard Planet and Secondhand, have been instrumental in making me understand what's at stake in the topics that we're here to talk about today, but also just the ambition of a journalist who's prepared to go into the field and meet the very people that are at the cutting edge of the topic that we're wanting to know more about. And so I think for scholars in the audience, the kind of journalism that Adam has been doing at Bloomberg and in this different long-form writing has just been extraordinary as an example and illustration of a commitment to telling the real stories, the human stories behind what are often described as externalities. So Adam Minter is a Bloomberg journalist. He's spent a number of years both in China and Ghana, and I'm sure many other places we'll hear about. And he's now based in the US. So I think that's right. We're going to hear a little bit about his story today. And so the first session here, we're just going to have a Q&A, really, where I get to nerd out and ask Adam a number of questions I've wanted to ask for many years. And we'll also open up to questions and make sure that those of you here in the room can also interact. So Adam, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm not quite sure which way I should look. I think I should wave to you directly. Hi.
I'll wave back.
It's great to see you.
Yes.
So for those of the people here who haven't been lucky enough to read your work yet, why don't you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in the topic of waste?
Yeah, I was born into it, quite literally. I'm the third generation son of a very small Minneapolis metal scrapyard. Not a very big one, small enough that some of my earliest memories are walking around in the scrapyard, in the warehouse, and also working in it, disassembling things like plumbing scrap. And I sometimes joke, but it's not entirely funny. If somebody, say, from National Geographic had taken a picture of me in those days, it might have become the basis of a human rights campaign. I did not want to work in the business. I wanted to write and be a journalist, and it was not my intention to write about this industry. But the New Yorker wasn't going to just have me based on nothing. So I went to work for trade journals that covered this industry. And over time, I kept thinking I would get out of it, but in fact, I got deeper and deeper. I moved to China, spent 12 years investigating China's mostly non-ferrous and electronics trade through the boomiest of boom years in the 2000s, and then moved on to Malaysia, where I lived until COVID started, with interludes in Ghana and other places where I continued to, if you will, dive into the scrap heap. And that's where the two books came from.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can't get much more qualified than that. And the thing that really, I think, challenges the reader straight up front in the first book, Junkyard Planet, is the moment when you say, if what you toss into your recycling bin can be used in some way, the international scrap recycling business will manage to deliver it to the person or company who can do so most profitably. And you say, usually, but not always, that profitable option is going to be the most sustainable one. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that quote, because I think one of the reasons I really wanted you to talk with us today is there's been a bit of change, I guess, since Junkyard Planet came out, and whether you think that's still a true statement, or what are you thinking about it now?
Yeah, I'm glad you start with that. when I wrote that, I was still very much thinking about what had happened in 2007, 2008 in the global scrap trade, not just electronics, but in metals as well. If folks recall, there was a global commodities boom, and certain commodities, steel, copper, aluminum, reached peaks that they had never reached before. And all of a sudden, metal was coming literally out of the forest. I talk in Junkyard Planet about automobiles that were deep in the forests of the United States that had been sitting there for 30, 40 years. Nobody had touched them because it wasn't worth it. But the price of steel had risen so high that people were going out into the forest and pulling these cars out and bringing them to scrapyards. And it was wonderful because there was basically a century-long backlog of cars in the United States. And it was also a little bit horrifying as well that that it took this market boom for that stuff to finally get cleaned up. But for me, it created it explains something to me. Why do these things go where they go? Why does scrap go to Ghana, or why does it go to China, or why does it? A lot of it's going to Malaysia these days, and it's really the market dynamics. And I think there's a strong belief from folks who aren't in the business that it's an environmental imperative. Recycling is an environmental imperative. But what I learned over the years, and I come from the business, so I kind of knew it, but I really saw it in China, is that what recycling is it's a commercial imperative. And if those markets don't exist, stuff doesn't get recycled. I mean, if you throw a can into your recycling bin and there's nobody who wants to make something new from it, it's not recycling. It's trash. And so that was kind of what I was getting at there, that the markets, it's a very market-oriented business, whether people like it or not. In terms of what's changed, I don't think much has. I know that we have, we've seen these restrictions be imposed in China, but those restrictions have been mischaracterized often. There is still large amounts of scrap metal and electronics flowing into China. Not as much as in the past. It tends to be higher grade, but what is China importing? It's importing what it needs because it needs the raw materials. And so that stuff is still finding its destination.
Yeah, when you do tell the story about the cars being retrieved,
Yeah.
it really resonated with me because I had just finished this study at Intel where we'd been trying to encourage consumers to bring their old laptops out of the closet. Because one of the things about electronic waste is that we don't even really have great data on what's possible to recycle because there's so much hoarding of old devices that doesn't even make it into the waste stream. So I had these visions of like people at some point in history needing to get that hidden, what they call the urban mine of electronics back into the system, right? Because there will probably be a higher price on it eventually.
Well, and can I jump in on that? Because it's interesting. Some of that has happened. The older Intel chips, the 486DX chip, if you go online, there is a vast network of collectors out there. They love the 486DX chip because it's full of gold. And if you go on eBay, if you find places where the collectors, and there's whole collectors groups, they will go around asking people, if you have these older Intels in your closet, we would like to buy them. And the reason they want to buy them is those gold heavy chips. Intel doesn't make chips with that much gold in them anymore, but there is an element of that still happening.
It's awesome to hear that because that was another thing I was trying to convince my Intel colleagues of, the viability of these secondary and tertiary markets. But it does seem as though, that's a little bit further away from the core business. And I think that's another topic we'll be covering today, the way in which the industry is coordinated around the first user. And it really gets to the point that both of your books raises, and that is, who defines something as waste, and how does that carry on to have effects in that potential secondary or subsequent use? So how do you think about waste, Adam, and what are your thoughts on the way this is playing out, particularly in electronics?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's something that I've spending an increasing amount of time thinking about. I think there's a real tension right now in the way that people outside of the business think about it. The tension is between the person who defines waste being the consumer versus the regulator. And from my perspective, as somebody who does this, meaning I go into the field in clothing, electronics, metals, I think the person who ultimately does define what is waste and should define it is the person who wants to make something from it or who wants to resell it. That could very well be somebody with a used computer business in Tamale, Ghana, a used clothing business in Guatemala City, Guatemala. To my mind, it's a bit unfortunate, but I think in Western countries, and especially the OECD, there seems to be a belief that no, it shouldn't be the end users, oftentimes in emerging markets, who are deciding. It should be the regulators, and it should be the manufacturers. And there is this increasing nexus between the manufacturers and the regulators, I think, that is actually anti-sustainability. I'm sure you'll have a lot of discussions about Apple, but I think Apple's a very good example because Apple has a take-back program. They will happily, at least in the US, take back your phone, give you a little rebate to buy a new one. What happens to those old phones? If it's a recent model, they will resell it. They have people they work with who will resell it. But once you start getting down to, say, an iPhone 8, a 5-year-old phone, those phones will be shredded. They'll say these are waste. But I can tell you, because I know the people who do it, I could send those phones to Ghana and there would be a ready market for them. And that market means that there's people who would continue reusing them. And from my perspective, reuse is always a higher sustainability value than recycling. And I think that's where there's a lot of danger in the desire to say, no, we shouldn't export this e-waste. Is that desire to do that coming from a Western perspective, an OECD perspective that says we're ultimately trying to protect the manufacturers, or is it coming from a perspective of the consumers of these items, these used items, the people who want to make new things from them? So for me, that's a real interest and something that I think that scholars of this industry and this activity need to be thinking very seriously about.
Well, thank you for endorsing this event and why we're doing it, because the more you look into it, the thing that also becomes apparent when you're trying to relocalize use and reuse in electronics is it's not really clear that there is even the infrastructure in many local contexts to enable that reuse. So you mentioned in your work the way in which American factories for refining copper shut down at a certain point due to the cost of compliance, and environmental compliance being one of those forms of oversight. And yet, there's now this evolution in the discussion where even if companies and manufacturers do make commitments to sustainability, they're still making products that are designed in a way with materials that can't be refined and reused. So what are your thoughts on this ongoing gap between tech companies' statements about sustainability, and particularly that circularity piece, because that's going to be the focus of much of our chat today, I think. What do we need to do to actually make a waste and recycling infrastructure really local in that sense that would make it viable?
Yeah, I actually just spoke to a clothing recyclers convention, and the title of the talk was Preserving the Circular Economies That We Already Have. I always sort of get my back up when I hear corporate entities say we need to create circular economies, because I think there are some very good ones out there. I mean, I've been documenting them for much of my career, especially in the reuse area. And it's remarkable because Apple may say, or Dell may say, although Dell does a pretty good job, Samsung may say, oh, this is not recyclable. This cannot be reused. This cannot be serviced. But what you find is if you go to Ghana and you spend time in the repair shops in these smaller towns, these products can be serviced. And the ingenuity and the entrepreneurship is extraordinary. And again, I think we still have to be thinking about who we're letting define what is sustainable and what is circular. And I think there's a real tendency to deny, I'll use the term, I think, deny agency to emerging markets. I think we give agency in this activities in this industry to the OECD. We do not give it to the emerging markets. My concern in terms of non-sustainable products, I mean, there's always going to be waste. There is always going to be something in a smartphone that can't be recycled. It's just going to be very difficult to do it from an economic perspective. There'll be a few grains of some kind of element in that screen that just cannot be extracted. So for me, it then becomes a question of where do you recycle this stuff? You do want to design it for recycling, and I believe we're misplacing where we put this recycling infrastructure. Instead of putting it outside of Sydney so that an iPhone 8 can be shredded, or outside of Brussels or outside of Minneapolis, we should be putting it outside of Accra, because that's where the end user is. That's where the technology for recycling these kinds of things should be placed. And I think that's important, both if you're interested in the ultimate sustainability of these objects, if you're interested in environmental justice, which I am, and I think that is justice if you are actually putting this kind of high-tech infrastructure in the places where the end use is in. If you care about, and I care about it a lot, bridging technological gaps, technological equity gaps. And I think that's how I'm thinking about these kinds of subjects. I mean, certainly we know that production and mining is, from a carbon perspective, the major contributor to environmental destruction, but we're still going to be making new stuff. So I would like to see this stuff recycled in the places where it's ultimately used.
Yeah, thanks. That's very, very compelling. So as people here think of their questions for Adam, I did just want to ask one more clarification, or at least reiteration of what you've been saying, because the other insight from your book that just struck me so formidably is how you state that secondhand is the consumer economy. And it really does relate to the point I was introducing us to think about, with this point that if all technology in this hyper competitive AI-driven debate right now is being designed for high performance, what does that mean for those who still haven't even been able to afford to get online in the first place? So it's one of the things I really value in your work, is to make that point. So how do you see that future where that ongoing unwillingness to recognise the secondhand or secondary market as the majority of the world's experience of accessing technology? How do we try and make that more obvious?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. I mean, obviously, when I wrote that, I was thinking. I remember writing that specific sentence, thinking of Lagos, Nigeria, and you walk down what is a high street there, and the high street is filled with secondhand shops, great secondhand shops. It's 90% of the retail economy. And one of the reasons that doesn't get recognized is that international aid agencies, the World Bank, all of these funding agencies, when they go to a country and they say, we want to lend you money and we want to see a growing economy does not mean secondhand shops on the high streets in Accra and Lagos. And that becomes this perverse incentive to buy new, to emphasize new. And yet, despite that, the secondhand economy continues to thrive in these places, and it's an innovative economy. Let me give you an example from the world of EVs. There's a lot of regulation being attempted in places like the EU and the US right now. They want to keep the batteries from these EVs in these countries, and say, well, once it's depleted 80%, then it needs to be recycled here, and we need to keep those resources there. But they're finding that these EVs, even relatively recent ones, once they hit 80% of their battery, they're being exported to West Africa. And so you actually see this injection of high-tech automobiles, relatively recent Teslas, and other types of electronics actually landing in these places, much to the frustration of regulators in the EU and in the US, who are saying, wait, we want to recycle these things. Recycling is good, but actually, I think getting this material into West Africa, and I keep bringing up West Africa because it's where I've spent a lot of time, and I think about it a lot, but it could be anywhere really where you have these kinds of economies. I think that's very exciting. And so I tend to be more optimistic about the technology curve in emerging markets. I think that the stuff gets there quicker than people realize. There's the demand there, and the demand for something that's 20% off, if you will, or whatever it is, 30% off is extraordinary. And you still see, despite the global economy where it is, you still see upward mobility in a lot of these places. So I think it's the outlook, in my opinion, for these non-OECD countries is better than maybe it's often thought.
Yeah, maybe better than other places where we might be. Well, that's a wonderful introduction, and I think I'm going to turn to the room now because that's all I can see in terms of if anybody would like to ask a question of Adam while we have him. And Anna has a roving mic. You're probably just going to see the back of a head, Adam, but...
Okay, so long as I can hear, it's all good.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Great.
So I'll turn back and you'll see the back of my head again so I can see you, unfortunately.
Okay.
But, yeah, I was an avid reader of Shanghai Scrap when I was living in China in the mid to late 2000s. And it was one of the points of inspiration for work I was doing with my students around e-waste industries. And
thank you.
yeah, I wanted to ask you a question around regulation because one of the things that I sort of discovered then, and everything comes with some sort of grain of salt or whatever, but was the sort of illegal status of electronic waste industries.
Yeah.
Apparently. Yet, the kind of, what interested me was how contradiction multiplies itself in interesting ways in China. And so you would find then e-waste collectors who needed a license to trade. And they were able to provide a sort of stable price on the waste for collectors as distinct from the more informal sector. So I want to sort of ask you what sort of thoughts you had around regulation and the kind of contradiction of governance in a place like China, and also the way in which that kind of liberalization in a way kind of conditioned interesting things, possibilities. And I'm thinking particularly of all sorts of invention and innovation in the informal sector in, secondhand waste industries, like, for instance, plugging dual SIMs, multiple SIMs into phones because you need it as you moved across provinces. And the way in which that sort of invention, it could be seen as a form of R&D in the informal sector that is then, expropriated by big tech. It's kind of free labor in another sense of that word. So I wonder if you have some thoughts around that and how, it's distinct in the case of China with regard to the question of governance.
I think in developing, in emerging markets, I think you do see this contradiction in a lot of places at the ports. Ghana, I'll get to China in a second, but Ghana is quite similar in some respects in that the government is publicly very critical of the import of secondhand goods, of electronics and clothes. And yet if you go to the port of Tema, it's coming in. There are inspectors looking at these loads and they're assessing taxes on it, and in some cases taking bribes on it. So on one hand, they will speak publicly, and some of that is for not local consumption, but for global consumption from, aid agencies, from lenders who expect them to be opposed to these imports. And yet at the same time, Tema is the major port in Ghana, and large volumes of it are flowing in. And if you talk off record, I have to be careful how I put this, but if you talk off record to officials in countries like Ghana, they will tell you that we need this material, electronics specifically, to bridge the digital divide. So I think there's, oftentimes in emerging markets, there's these competing motivations, and they do the best that they can to balance them. And sometimes the best that they can do is hope that journalists and scholars don't come around to poke their noses into it. In terms of China, the contradictions were even deeper. You may recall at one point, especially in the 2000s, Guiyu, which is a town in southern China. At the time, in the 2000s, it could take about 5 hours to drive from Shenzhen, which was and is the electronics manufacturing capital of the world, to Guiyu. And Guiyu, a lot of what its business was taking the manufacturing leftovers out of Shenzhen and recycling them into gold, or they would first test them and see if they could then be reused. And so you had a huge toy industry grow up around Guiyu. And what those toys were these low-end toys that were made from essentially defective chips from Shenzhen. The government loved this. except when you had 60 Minutes or other journalists come in and shine a camera on the refining operations, which were a very small part of what Guiyu was, but they were part of it. Nonetheless, there's zero question that the government of China at a very high level was open to Guiyu. There's pictures of Xi Xianhua, who some of you may know, he was for many years the chief, until a couple of years ago, the chief climate negotiator for China. And there's pictures. I used to show them in some of my presentations of him walking through Guiyu and examining operations. And he wasn't there to shut them down. He thought they were a great idea because they were good for the economy. They helped bridge digital divides there. And, you know, maybe I'm not going to subscribe to this argument, but maybe keeping it all in one place instead of spread out all over Guangdong province was superior, especially at a stage in China's development where environmental regulation was not as effective, let's put it. So these contradictions aren't unusual to China, but in China, they're just like everything. They're just much bigger, both in terms of the moral contradictions and just the operational ones.
Look, Adam, it's just been such an incredible privilege to have you with us, and your energy is infectious. I knew you would be the best person to open this discussion because it really does open the aperture on what we should be aware of globally on this topic. Thank you for joining us, and we'll get to see you in person at some point.
Yeah. No, let me just say, I think it's just so great that there's this kind of forum. I'm so glad to see scholars in particular discussing this stuff. It's just excellent. So good luck to everyone with the conference.